the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are no heroes among the common folk, only survivors. While space marines wage glorious wars across the stars and planetary governors feast in gilded halls, billions upon billions of ordinary humans toil in obscurity, their lives measured not in years but in shifts worked, quotas met, and prayers recited. These are the faceless masses whose labor fuels the Imperium's endless war machine, whose faith sustains its corrupt bureaucracy, and whose deaths go unrecorded in the vast ledgers of human suffering. This is not a tale of glory or conquest. There are no bolter-wielding heroes here, no dramatic last stands against impossible odds. Instead, this is the story of Mara, a hab worker in Hive Primus on the forge world of Metallicus 6, of Jacob, a third-generation farmer on the agri world of Verdant Prime, of Sister Lucia, whose devotion to the emperor is as genuine as her terror of the ecclesiarchy's judgment. Through their eyes, we glimpse what it truly means to be human in an empire that treats humanity as its most expendable resource. Mara was born in sub-level 447 of Hive Primus, delivered by an unlicensed midwife in a cramped hab-unit, shared by 3 families. Her first breath was of recycled air, so thick with industrial pollutants that her lungs would never be truly clear. By age 5, she was working in the sorting halls, separating recyclable materials from waste, tiny hands perfect for reaching into machinery too delicate for adult fingers. The overseers called it light duty, suitable for children. The missing fingers on half the workers told a different story. Education came in 15-minute intervals between shifts, taught by exhausted scribes who recited Imperial catechisms by rote. Mara learned to recognize the numerals needed to count components and the symbols that indicated dangerous materials. She learned that the emperor protects, though she'd never seen evidence of it in her life. She learned that complaint was heresy, and that heresy meant becoming a servitor, those shambling cybernetic horrors that haunted her nightmares. By adolescence, Mara had been promoted to the assembly lines, fitting microcomponents into targeting cogitators bound for naval vessels she would never see. 12-hour shifts stretched into 16 during rush orders. The nutritional paste dispensed at shift changes tasted like rust and regret, but it kept her alive and working. Sleep came in 4-hour blocks on a bunk shared with 2 other workers on different shifts. The mattress was never cold. Romance, if it could be called that, happened in stolen moments. Mara and Petrus, a fellow line worker, would sometimes coordinate their break times and meet in a forgotten storage alcove. Their courtship consisted of shared ration packs and whispered complaints they'd never dare voice publicly. When Mara discovered she was pregnant, they formally registered their union with the administratum, a process that took 6 hours of waiting and cost Petrus a week's rations and processing fees. Their daughter, Elena, was born in the same cramped hab unit where Mara had entered the world. The cycle continued. Within 5 years, Elena would be in the sorting halls. Within 10, on the assembly lines. Within 20, if she survived, she'd be teaching her own children to accept their fate with quiet dignity. This was life in the Imperium, a vast churning machine that consumed generations and produced nothing but more machinery and more generations to feed into itself. Jakob's world couldn't have been more different from Mara's, yet it was equally oppressive in its own way. Verdant Prime was an agri world, one of thousands that fed the Imperium's endless hunger. Where Mara saw only metal and smoke, Jakob woke each morning to genuine sunlight, filtering through the canopy of the grain forests, genetically modified wheat that grew 15 meters tall, its stalks as thick as a man's arm. The beauty was deceptive. Jakob's family had worked the same plot for 7 generations, their names recorded in administrative ledgers that stretched back centuries. They didn't own this land. No one on Verdant Prime owned anything. They were permitted to work it, to live on it, to die on it. In exchange, they gave the Imperium 90% of everything they grew. The remaining 10% had to feed them, clothe them, and provide seeds for next season's planting. His father had taught him the farmer's prayer, recited each dawn before work began. Emperor, we offer you the fruit of our labor. May our hands strengthen your armies. May our grain feed your warriors. May our sacrifice be worthy of your notice. The words came automatically now, muscle memory more than faith. Jacob had long ago stopped wondering if anyone was listening. The harvest machinery was ancient, passed down through generations and held together with prayers to the Omnissiah and liberal applications of improvised welding. When the great harvester broke down, and it broke down constantly, Jacob's family would spend days repairing it while the grain ripened and threatened to spoil. The Mechanicus tech priests who occasionally visited from the orbital station would fix major problems, but their services cost a tithe of its own. Jacob's grandfather had paid such a tithe once, and the family had nearly starved that winter. During harvest season, the entire family worked until collapse. Jacob, his wife Sarah, their 3 children, his parents, even his grandmother, who could barely walk, all of them in the fields from dawn until the moons rose. The grain had to be cut, bundled, processed, and delivered to the collection depot before the administratum's deadline. Missing quota meant investigations, and investigations meant Arbites, and Arbites meant people disappeared. Jacob had seen it happen to the Martins family 3 plots over. Their youngest son had been conscripted into the Imperial Guard, taking with him the labor of 2 men. They couldn't make quota. The Arbites came in their black chimeras, arrested the parents for failure to meet tithe obligations, and redistributed their children to other families as indentured servants. The land was reassigned to a family from another district. Within a month, it was as if the Martins had never existed. The fear never left. Every rain shower that came at the wrong time, every pest infestation, every mechanical failure carried the potential for catastrophe. Jacob would lie awake at night calculating yields, adding up numbers in his head, praying to the emperor that this year would be enough. Just enough. Not prosperity. That was a dream for the nobility. Just enough to survive 1 more year and start the cycle again. And yet, there were moments. Summer evenings when the grain forest whispered in the wind, and his children laughed as they chased some small creature through the stalks. The taste of real bread, made from grain they'd held back from the tithe. A criminal act that could doom them all, but for 1 moment, tasting like something other than recycled nutrients. His wife's hand in his, as they watched the sunset paint the grain gold. These moments didn't justify the suffering, but they made it survivable. Sister Lucia had chosen her path, or so she told herself. Born on the shrine world of Ophelia 7, she had been raised in an environment so saturated with religious fervor that questioning faith was literally unthinkable. Every building was a temple. Every street corner had a shrine. Every conversation was peppered with prayers and catechisms. The air itself seemed heavy with incense and expectation. As a child, she'd been part of the children's chorus, singing hymns at dawn services that lasted 3 hours. As an adolescent, she joined the Sisterhood of the Sacred Rose as a lay servant, cleaning the vast cathedral halls and assisting with ceremonies. By her 20th year, she'd taken preliminary vows, committing herself to a life of service to the ecclesiarchy. It wasn't quite becoming a sister of battle. That required genetic enhancements and brutal training she'd never qualify for, but it was service nonetheless. Her duties were mundane but constant. She scrubbed floors in the cathedral's endless corridors. She laundered vestments for priests whose names she'd never know. She helped prepare the sacred oils Shoppa used in baptism and last rites. During major festivals, she stood for hours holding ceremonial candles or incense burners, her arms aching and her feet going numb, her face frozen in an expression of devotional ecstasy she'd long ago learned to fake. The pilgrims were the worst part. Millions arrived each year, drawn by the world's reputation for miracles and the presence of countless holy relics. They came seeking blessings, healing, or simply the comfort of standing in proximity to holiness. They came desperate and hopeful, and they left lighter in purse and heavier in heart, having purchased blessed tokens, sacred oils, or relics of dubious authenticity. Lucia had learned not to think too carefully about where the relics came from. She'd once walked past a workshop where artisans carved bone fragments from Saint Celestine's tomb. Using bones that definitely hadn't come from any tomb, she'd seen priests blessing water from the city's public fountains and selling it as tears wept by angels. She'd watched the ecclesiarchy's accountants tally donations with the same cold efficiency as any merchant, dividing proceeds between operational costs, bribes to local authorities, and a comfortable stipend for the senior clergy. Her crisis of faith had come gradually, then all at once. A pilgrim woman, elderly and frail, had traveled across the sector to pray at the shrine of Saint Marguerite the Merciful, hoping for healing from a disease that was slowly killing her. The woman had spent her life's savings on passage to Ophelia 7, on donations to the church, on blessed remedies sold by sympathetic vendors. Lucia had been the one to find her 3 days later, dead in a side chapel, her final prayer still on her lips. The priests had been unmoved. The emperor called her home, they'd said, and arranged for her body to be processed into corpse starch. Her belongings were catalogued and sold, the proceeds going to church coffers. The woman's name was added to a list of those who had achieved martyrdom through faith, which sounded noble but meant nothing. Lucia had stood in the chapel that night, staring at the spot where the woman had died, and felt something break inside her. She couldn't leave. Apostasy meant death. The Arbites enforced religious law with merciless efficiency. She couldn't speak her doubts. Confession to a priest would result in re-education, or worse. So she continued her duties, performing the rituals with hollow precision, singing hymns with a voice empty of feeling. She had become what so many Imperial citizens eventually became, someone who went through the motions of faith because faith was mandatory, not because it provided comfort. At night, alone in her cell, she would sometimes pray. Not to the emperor. She wasn't sure he was listening, if he even existed in the way the ecclesiarchy claimed. She prayed to something else, something nameless and distant. She prayed for the strength to endure one more day of performance, one more service of empty gestures. And somehow morning always came, and she would rise and do it all again. Tobias had made a mistake. That's all it took. One mistake, one moment of curiosity, one question asked at the wrong time, in front of the wrong person. He'd been a data clerk in the administratum on Crixus Majoris, processing shipping manifests and tithe records. It was tedious work, but it was safe work. The kind of position that could carry you to a modest retirement if you kept your head down and never questioned the numbers. But Tobias had noticed something, a pattern in the manifests he processed. Shipments being diverted, resources vanishing into administrative blind spots, wealth flowing upward through carefully obscured channels. It looked like corruption, which was nothing unusual in the Imperium. But this corruption was on a scale that suggested involvement from high-ranking officials, possibly even the planetary governor. He'd mentioned it to a colleague he thought he could trust, asked if others had noticed the same patterns. That colleague had reported him to their supervisor as potentially harboring seditious thoughts. The supervisor, protecting their own position, had reported it to the Arbites. Within 6 hours, Tobias was in custody. Within 12 hours, he'd been tried, convicted of malicious speculation against the Imperium's servants, and sentenced to servitor conversion. The process was clinical, mechanical, devoid of mercy or meaning. He was stripped, shaved, and subjected to cranial surgery while partially conscious. The augmetics needed to interface with his nervous system required him to be aware during installation. He felt every incision, every implant being forced into his brain tissue, every wire threaded through his spine. They didn't bother with anesthetics beyond the minimum necessary to prevent him from dying of shock. When it was over, Tobias was no longer Tobias. His memories remained, a cruel quirk of servitor conversion, but his ability to act on those memories, to respond to them emotionally, had been severed. He could remember his wife Irina, his daughter Cassie, the home they'd shared. He could remember loving them, but he couldn't feel that love anymore. It was data, stored and accessible, but devoid of emotional content. His new function was sanitation. He joined a crew of servitors who maintained the administratum buildings he'd once worked in as a free man. His days were spent cleaning latrines, mopping floors, emptying waste receptacles. Simple tasks assigned to simple minds, he performed them with mechanical efficiency, his cybernetic enhancements ensuring he never tired, never complained, never stopped working until commanded to do so. Sometimes he would see her. Irina hadn't left the planet after his conversion. She couldn't afford passage even if she wanted to flee. She still worked in the lower administrative halls, processing the same kind of manifest Tobias once handled. She had learned her lesson. Never question, never speculate, never notice patterns. Keep your head down and survive. The first time their paths crossed after his conversion, she'd stopped dead, recognizing him despite the cybernetics and the vacant eyes. He'd registered her presence. His optical implants noted and cataloged her image. But he couldn't respond, couldn't reach out, couldn't tell her he was still in here, still aware, trapped in a prison of his own unresponsive flesh. He simply moved past her, shambling toward his next assigned task while she stood frozen in horror. She came to see him regularly after that, though it was forbidden and dangerous. She would find him during his maintenance duties and talk to him, tell him about Cassie's progress in school, about the small events of their lives. He couldn't respond, couldn't give any sign that he heard or understood. But she came anyway, speaking to the ghost of the man she'd loved, refusing to let him disappear completely into the machinery. This was the Imperium's justice, not death, which would have been mercy, but eternal servitude. Tobias would continue to function for decades, perhaps centuries if his biological components were properly maintained. He would outlive his wife, his daughter, possibly his grandchildren. He would serve until his augmetics failed, or until he was damaged beyond repair and recycled for parts. And he would remember, every moment of every day, what it had been like to be human. Vex had never intended to become a criminal. But in the Imperium, the line between survival and criminality was often measured in stolen rations or unreported salvage. He lived in the underhive of Taraxis Prime, in the lawless depths where the Arbites rarely ventured, and where the Emperor's light was more theoretical than actual. Down here, you made your own rules or died following someone else's. The black market was the underhive's true economy. Everything that disappeared from official channels, food, medicine, weapons, tech, eventually found its way down here. Vex specialized in medical supplies, a dangerous trade given how desperately they were needed and how heavily they were controlled. He had contacts among loading dock workers who could skim a few packages from each shipment. He knew medical orderlies who would report supplies as damaged or expired, and then funnel them to his distribution network. His customers were people the Imperium had abandoned. The injured who couldn't afford official medical care, the sick who'd been denied treatment, the desperate who'd lost everything and had nowhere else to turn. A woman whose child had hive fever, but who couldn't queue for 12 hours at the public medici station. An old man with an infected wound that would kill him without antibiotics. A pregnant woman who needed clean water and proper nutrition to have any chance of a healthy birth. Vex charged them, of course. He had to survive too. But his prices were fair by underhive standards. A vial of antibiotics might cost the equivalent of a week's rations, or a valuable piece of salvage. Pain suppressors went for whatever the buyer could afford. Sometimes he gave medicine away, to children or the truly desperate, though he never admitted it. Sentiment was weakness in the underhive, and perceived weakness attracted predators. The danger was constant. Rival gangs wanted to control his distribution network, but Nuke's corrupt Arbites wanted bribes to look the other way. The Mechanicus would execute him for tech heresy if they discovered he was jury-rigging medical equipment. And the shadow cults that proliferated in the underhive depths wanted to recruit him, convert him, or eliminate him as competition. Vex had learned to navigate these dangers through careful neutrality. He paid his bribes on time. He never took sides in gang warfare. He sold to everyone equally, loyalists, heretics, mutants. It didn't matter. As long as they could pay and didn't threaten his operation, he'd do business. This pragmatism kept him alive but cost him sleep. He knew that one day his luck would run out, that the Arbites would finally decide he was worth the effort to arrest, or a gang would decide his network was worth seizing, or a cult would decide he knew too much. That day came during what should have been a routine transaction. A tech priest from the upper hive wanted medical supplies for unauthorized research, the kind of research that skirted the edges of tech heresy. Vex had done business with him before and considered him reliable, but this time the tech priest was being watched. Arbites had been investigating him for months and used Vex's meeting as grounds to raid both parties. The fight was brief and brutal. Vex's guards died covering his escape, buying him time to disappear into the underhive's labyrinthine tunnels. But he knew he couldn't stay. The Arbites would tear the underhive apart looking for him, and someone would eventually betray his location for reward money. He had to run, leave everything he'd built, become a refugee in the vast urban sprawl of the hive. His last act before fleeing was to distribute his remaining inventory. He left caches of medicine in places where the desperate would find them, passed along contact information for his suppliers to trusted intermediaries, ensured the network would continue without him. It was foolish and sentimental, but he'd built something that mattered, a system that saved lives the Imperium considered expendable. If he was going to disappear, he'd ensure his work survived. The conscription notice arrived without warning, as they always did. Marcus was working in the hab-units' communal kitchen when the Arbites kicked down the door, data slate in hand with his name and citizen identification number clearly listed. He was 23 standard years old, in reasonable health, and had no critical occupational exemptions. That made him eligible for the Astra Militarum draft. He had 10 minutes to gather his belongings. There was no appeal process, no deferment option, no time to say proper goodbyes. His mother wept silently. Loud displays of emotion in front of Arbites were unwise. His younger sister pressed a small icon of the Emperor into his hand, the only possession of value their family owned. His father gripped his shoulder once, conveying everything that couldn't be said aloud in those final moments. The collection depot was chaos incarnate. Hundreds of conscripts from across the hive sector, ranging from teenagers barely old enough to hold a lasgun to middle-aged workers pulled from factory lines. They were processed with assembly line efficiency, stripped of civilian clothing, issued identical gray fatigues, given rudimentary medical examinations that consisted of checking whether they could walk and see. Those who failed even these minimal standards were declared unfit and, Marcus suspected, probably converted into servitors rather than sent home. Training was 6 weeks of brutality designed to transform civilians into soldiers. Drill instructors screamed constantly. Beatings were administered for the slightest infraction, and live-fire exercises killed roughly 5% of each training cohort. Marcus learned to march in formation, to field strip and maintain a lasgun, to dig a fighting position, to follow orders without hesitation. He learned that individual life meant nothing, that he was simply one component in a vast military machine, that his purpose was to die if necessary, to achieve objectives he'd never understand. The indoctrination was constant. Commissars delivered daily lectures about duty, sacrifice, and the honor of dying for the emperor. Religious services were mandatory, with priests thundering about humanity's manifest destiny and the righteousness of the Imperium's endless wars. Dissent was punished immediately. A conscript who questioned the morality of their mission was shot in front of the entire company as an example. The message was clear. You were no longer a person with thoughts and agency. You were a weapon aimed at the emperor's enemies. Marcus's regiment was shipped out after training, packed into the vast cargo holds of a troop transport with thousands of other soldiers. The journey took months. Space travel in the Imperium was slow and unreliable. They existed in a dim twilight world of cramped bunks, inadequate rations, and the constant background hum of the ship's engines. Disease spread through the holds. Dozens died and were unceremoniously jettisoned into space. No one kept track of their names. The war they arrived to prosecute was against orc raiders on a feral world whose name Marcus never learned. His regiment was one of dozens deployed, part of a crusade to pacify the sector. They deployed via dropship, a terrifying descent through anti-aircraft fire that killed hundreds before they even reached the ground. Marcus survived by luck. His dropship crashed but didn't explode, and he pulled himself from the wreckage into a hell of mud, blood, and screaming. Combat was nothing like the propaganda hollows. It was noise and confusion and terror. The orcs were massive, brutal creatures who charged their positions with animal fury. His lasgun felt pathetically inadequate against their thick hides and crude armor. He watched friends, men he'd trained with, suffered with, torn apart by orc weapons or trampled under their savage advance. He fired until his power pack ran dry, reloaded with shaking hands, and fired again. The campaign lasted 8 months. Marcus's regiment took 80% casualties, reduced from 5,000 soldiers to fewer than 1,000 survivors. Those who survived were not evacuated or given respite. They were simply folded into another regiment and deployed to a new war zone, this one against heretical cultists on an industrial world. And then another, and another. The Imperium's wars were endless, and soldiers fought until they died or became too broken to continue. Marcus stopped counting battles after the first year. He stopped learning the names of replacement soldiers after the second. He stopped feeling fear after the third, not because he became brave, but because sustained terror eventually burns out the emotional capacity to feel it. He became a hollow thing, a mechanical killer who followed orders, fought when commanded, and waited for the death that would inevitably claim him. His only connection to his former life was the icon his sister had given him, kept in a pouch on his uniform. Sometimes, during the brief respites between campaigns, he would hold it and try to remember what it felt like to be Marcus from Hive Tertius, to have a family and a name and a future. But those memories grew dimmer with each passing year. until they seemed to belong to someone else entirely. In the depths of Hive Secundus, in a forgotten maintenance tunnel where even the Arbites rarely ventured, something remarkable existed. A school. Not a sanctioned institution, not an approved schola, but a secret place where a former teacher named Helena gathered children and taught them things the Imperium didn't want them to know. She taught them genuine history, not propaganda. She taught them literature and philosophy, subjects considered wasteful for the lower classes. She taught them to think critically, to question, to imagine a better world, all crimes punishable by death if discovered. Helena had once been a licensed instructor in a mid-hive schola, teaching approved curriculum to factory workers' children, but she'd made the mistake of trying to expand her students' minds beyond rote memorization, of teaching them to analyze rather than simply obey. She'd been reported, investigated, and narrowly avoided servitor conversion by fleeing into the underhive. Now she lived as a fugitive, but she couldn't stop teaching. It was who she was, her rebellion against the Imperium's grinding dehumanization. Her students came in secret, sneaking away from their families during sleep shifts or claiming to be running errands. They were the children of the desperate and the hopeful, parents who wanted something better for their offspring, who were willing to risk everything for the chance that education might offer a path to a life beyond subsistence. They learned to read beyond basic literacy, to do mathematics beyond simple counting, to understand the world in ways the Imperium considered dangerous. The lessons were dangerous in their simplicity. Helena taught them that they were people, not simply components in a machine, that their lives had value beyond their labor output, that they had the right to question authority, to dream of alternatives, to imagine themselves as something more than the Imperium had designated them to be. She taught them the most revolutionary concept of all, that they were human beings deserving of dignity, and that the systems oppressing them were not divine mandate, but human constructs that could, theoretically, be changed. She knew it was futile. These children would likely never escape the hive, never transcend their designated roles, never implement the ideas she planted in their minds. Most would probably die in factories or foundries, their potential wasted, their dreams crushed by the machinery of imperial existence. But a few might carry these ideas forward, might pass them to their own children, might preserve some spark of genuine humanity in the darkness. And that, Helena believed, was worth the risk. Across the Imperium, in countless hidden places and quiet moments, similar acts of defiance occurred. On Verdant Prime, farmers would gather after mandatory prayer services and sing old songs from before the Imperium, melodies that spoke of freedom and self-determination. On shrine worlds, pilgrims would leave secret messages of doubt and hope in the cracks of cathedral walls, creating a hidden archive of forbidden thoughts. In manufactorums, workers would deliberately slow production just enough to frustrate quotas without triggering investigation, a small rebellion against impossible demands. These acts changed nothing at the systemic level. The Imperium was too vast, too entrenched, too powerful to be meaningfully challenged by individual resistance. But they changed something in the people who committed them. They preserved some essential core of humanity that the Imperium sought to crush. They proved that, even in the most oppressive circumstances, people could choose defiance, could maintain connection to something beyond survival, could refuse to be entirely broken. Mara, toiling on her assembly line, had learned to insert tiny flaws into one in every 1,000 components she produced. Flaws subtle enough to pass initial inspection, but that might cause failures down the line. It was a meaningless gesture that would never be traced back to her, but it gave her a sense of agency, of fighting back, however ineffectively, against the system that consumed her life. Jakob, tending his fields, maintained a secret garden, hidden in the grain forest where he grew flowers. Useless, beautiful things that served no purpose except to exist. He would visit it sometimes at dawn, before the day's labor began, and remember that beauty was possible, that not everything needed to be functional and productive. Sister Lucia, performing her empty rituals, had begun leaving small notes in the prayer books, messages of doubt and questioning, seeds of apostasy for other sufferers to find. She knew she was damning herself. That discovery meant execution, but she couldn't stop. Someone had to acknowledge the hollowness, had to speak the doubts that everyone felt, but no one dared voice. Even Tobias, trapped in his servitor body, found his resistance. He couldn't control his actions, couldn't communicate, couldn't refuse his programming, but he could remember, could maintain his consciousness as a silent witness to his own enslavement, could preserve his identity in the private space of his own thoughts where even the mechanicus couldn't reach. It was the smallest possible form of defiance, but it was defiance nonetheless. These were the faceless billions of the Imperium, crushed by systems designed to extract every ounce of value from their existence, denied agency or dignity, treated as expendable resources rather than thinking, feeling beings. But they endured. They found moments of beauty and connection. They performed small acts of defiance. They maintained hope not for themselves, but for some distant future when humanity might be something more than what the Imperium had made it. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, these ordinary people prove something extraordinary, that the human spirit, however suppressed and brutalized, could not be entirely extinguished. That love, hope, beauty, and defiance could survive even in the most hostile conditions. That's simply continuing to be human, to care for each other, to dream of better things, to refuse complete submission, was itself a form of victory. The Imperium would grind on, consuming generations in its endless wars and industrial processes. But as long as Helena taught her secret students, as long as Mara sabotaged her components, as long as Jacob tended his hidden garden, as long as Tobias remembered his name, the Imperium had not entirely won. Humanity persisted, not just as biological organisms filling designated roles, but as people capable of meaning and connection and resistance. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.